if there's an interest in discussing the stuff that we so hastily finished with that video, the pattern theory and what we were doing then, the floor is open to questions or comments. Or I think, in fact, as we were leaving, one or two people thought there were inconsistencies in the story. And I'm pretty confident that there aren't any inconsistencies in the story. We'll just have to go through it a little bit slowly. I needed you to think about it between then and now. But Brian, you had something you wanted to start with.
Yeah.
What was it?
The drawing, why that thing in the middle was there.
Oh, okay. So this is the drawing in question. I'm presuming the point of this, there should be one next to every transporter that ever receives anything, right? That's matter. In order to instantiate the pattern, you need some of this. So this is just a kind of a mix of all the different kinds of quarks and leptons that there are. Let's put it that way. My idea is that this is just sort of a general bunch of matter. So the pattern is going to say, among other things, now the pattern is going to have to set things up not only for the material configuration, but also it's going to have to, somehow record the fact that I'm thinking a particular thought just when it takes the pattern. And that's itself going to be another kind of pattern. That's going to be a distribution of energy, I suppose, across the material stuff of the central nervous system or something like that. That's what that's going to be. I don't know how to say that more precisely. I'm not a fan of the pattern theory, as I think you know from the story. But I think pattern theorists would say that there's some, in principle, there should be some way of understanding even thoughts and things as distributions of matter energy in some sense, some pattern. But this then is the stuff that you use to instantiate the pattern as you received it. All that's transmitted is the pattern. So that's just information. And this is like the raw eggs and flour that you use to make your pancakes. Okay?
I had a separate question too that had to do with your version. Well, actually,
Louder, please, so that others can hear you in the back. Don't just talk to me, because you're talking to the whole class.
When you said the lady calls up and she says, "Oh, okay, there's no problem," and everything, that means that when this thing started or whatever, someone knows that the body gets destroyed.
Oh, the company knows that. Everybody knows that. Matter of fact, it might even be in the brochure, this whole business about the disintegrator ray, but people seem to disregard it. This is like in the little cartoon, the scientists seem to see, he invented the silly machine, but he didn't seem to care one way or another about, going through it and the fact that the original has to be destroyed. And that's because, I presume that's because he's always looking at it at any point in time. He's looking at it from the point of view of the copy, right? He's looking at it from the point of view of the thing that supposedly has been transported. From the point of view of the transportee, or the copy, as I would prefer to say it, everything looks hunky-dory. From that backward-looking point of view, the memories and the moods and the feelings and the thoughts that were recorded before the original, as I call it, gets destroyed. The original doesn't know anything about what's going on Mars. The original never gets any lunch. But by the same token, the copy doesn't know anything about anything that happens after the pattern has been recorded. And my position is that you no more transport your voice. Your voice doesn't go anywhere when you make a recording on a cassette and then give the cassette to somebody else. That's a copy of your voice. That's a transcription of your voice, if you like. But your voice doesn't go anywhere. And you haven't literally sent your voice to California if you put if you record a cassette and send it off in that direction. You send a copy of your voice. Sometimes when I tell a story, though, I ask you to imagine what happens if, instead of getting, disintegrated right away by the attendant, if I'm, let's say she's out to lunch too, right? And so I have to wait for an hour, and I'm getting more and more impatient. And finally, she comes back, and it's just about 1 o'clock. My whole lunch hour is shot. She finally comes back. I'm livid. I say, I'm suing. And she tries to pacify me, and then as I stalk out the door across the room over there in the incoming transporters, I see me. I see somebody who looks exactly like me, with the sole exception that that person looks well fed, whereas I'm starving, right? And so that would be the me coming back from lunch. And then the interesting question is to see that these are really very different people. I mean, they argue with one another, just like those two scientists did in the cartoon. Who would get my car keys? I mean, both of us would have the car keys, right? Because I keep them in my pocket. But who would get to drive the car home? Who would get the home? I mean, these would be things that both would argue about. Both would think they had good claims on. I mean, each one of them could say, I worked long and hard for the money to buy that car. It's mine. Because each one would remember things that way. And if the one argued, well, you're actually a copy of me, the other one would say, so what? You're just a continuing replica of yourself in any case, and maybe cite something like this business about the cells replicating themselves every 7 years. And the argument then would be, you're just doing it slower. If you don't go in this transporter, it's the same basic process, it's just you do it slower than I do. I just do it swoop in one fell swoop. Any other questions or comments about the story? More from Brian. Go ahead.
I don't know. Now that, I have a different way of looking. Now that, from what you just said, this thing, I don't really care that this thing is like that. It can make copies because maybe it should. I think if these people are different people, out of everyone else, who cares? As long as there's just one of them. So get rid of the rest.
That's exactly right. So get rid of the original since the copy gets to where it wants to go. That's that's the point of view, again, of the scientist when he's trying to explain his machine in the cartoon. But this doesn't impress me. I mean, you say from the point of view of everyone else, maybe, but that doesn't impress me. I don't care about anybody else's point of view but mine. I mean, if I'm talking about, what am I going to do? Am I going to go into this booth or not? I mean, I can tell you, given the way I've constructed that story, I can tell you exactly what my experiences are going to be. Let's say, supposedly, I'd call up someone and say, okay, I'll make an appointment with you for lunch. I'll see you at noon. And I don't eat breakfast that morning because I really want to have a nice lunch and I want to have a good appetite. I mean, all of this is pointless because I'm going to get in that booth and push the button and I'm going to be disintegrated. I might as well jump in front of a truck. I mean, this is not a way of getting lunch.
But you don't know, that's the whole point.
I will know that.
You'll know you're getting in the booth.
I will know that I get in the booth, and I will know that I'm being disintegrated, I presume, somehow. I will never have the experience. I will never have the experience of eating lunch.
You gave us the assumption that you knew that the sound was a disintegrating thing. What if you didn't?
Well, then I would, all right, but you're just saying the death would be painless. It's like sticking a needle in your arm. Why would I want to prepare for lunch and then stick a needle in my arm? Why would I want to prepare for lunch and then jump off a building or step in front of a truck?
But if you don't know what's going to happen, you can't put that in. You're just preparing for lunch and you don't know what happened. You're just dead. Oh well. I mean, who cares what you think?
I care what I think.
But what I'm saying is, we're all. I mean, actually, it's a bad. But we're all going to die at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Well, you're doing an able job of representing this case because this is exactly what the people who like the pattern theory say. And I have to, this may be just a point of sheer density, but I just don't see what point is being made here. Do you think, all right, but maybe you're not making the point for them. You're just saying one could look at it that way?
Well,
one would be wrong to look at that way. Again, this is me representing my philosophical position, and I want to be clear to everybody that I'm not telling you what the truth is about this. This is one of those issues that people argue about, and I am now doing, I've thrown away all the pretense of being, trying to be objective now, and I'm just representing my position. You are right in particular, but anyone else is right to sort of take all that with a grain of salt. I'm trying to make my case as best I can. And the right way to be a philosophical critic is to say, okay, is that case adequate? And I find that I'm at a loss as to what to say to the pattern theorist, not necessarily Brian, who argues that, it wouldn't make any difference. I think it makes all the difference that there is, all the difference in the world. That's all the difference that I care about. I don't really care about whether somebody else thinks I'm me. Let's say we have a different duplicate. This is not such a high-tech duplicate. This is just a tall person who bears some resemblance to me and who's able, through makeup, to make himself look very much like me and to fool people. Let's say that person makes off with my car, makes off with my house, makes off with my, all my wealth, manages to persuade other people that I'm not me. It's the same situation as far as I can tell. You say, well, why should anybody care which one is you, as long as they think it's you? I'm at a loss. It matters. The only person it seems that, 99% of its mattering, it has to do with me. It matters only a little bit what other people think.
But while you're saying what matters to me is all that matters, instead of saying what everyone else thinks, you take each and every one of everyone else, and they say, well, 99% what matters to me is I don't care if he died. Well, maybe I don't even know. As long as he's still there. That's why people don't like to say, oh, don't commit suicide because people are going to be all upset because you're not with them anymore. Well, they don't care because your copy's there. So as far as they know, each and every person, as far as which. Here's an interesting thing. If I was in a mood to commit suicide, for whatever reason, then this transporter might help me with one of the serious problems about suicide, and that's that other people feel bad, right? But unfortunately, the copy would want to commit suicide too, right? Unless we sort of edited the copy en route. But this does strike me as a means of committing suicide. I'm not finished here, but I think Sean wanted to say something.
Yeah, I've got a question for Brian.
Yeah.
Would you get in one of those transporters knowing you were going to die?
Well, he doesn't.
Only if I knew what was going to happen after that. So no. If I knew that there'd be no pain, no nothing after that, then yeah.
Okay, so that's very interesting. If you knew that it would be no pain at all, absolutely painless, and you wouldn't be aware of this disintegrator, say, that you went and you push the button and just painless,
I couldn't care less.
quick.
I walked out of this room and I was gone. No, I don't care.
No, wait a minute. Wait a minute now. Now that may just express, just the general view of life and stuff like that. But is there any difference? Does it make any difference to you that the copy of? Let's say I've got two booths. One is the one outside that makes a copy of you, and that copy goes out to lunch. Blah 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 blah. And then you remember there's the other booth that's back there in the office. It's nothing but a disintegrator. It's a little shorter. You remember? That means it doesn't have all the recording and transmitting equipment. All it has is the disintegrator in it. Okay. Would you step into that one? No way. Let's say again, painless. Both cases, the disintegrating process is absolutely painless. You step in. You can even push the button yourself. We'll revise the second booth that way, so it's not somebody else doing it to you.
If only if I knew that after the fact I would not experience. Not only can I not experience the process of dying, but I don't want to experience any pain after that.
Okay. So does that mean that you're suicidal?
No, because I know that is pain. I know what it causes. I know right now we
No.
don't.
But why would you step in either of these two booths? Let's forget about the transporter. Let's say all we have is a booth. All that there is a booth that has a little button in it, and it gives you a completely, utterly painless death.
Because to me, neither can I put no value on life, neither can I put an infinite value.
Right, I understand that.
Therefore, if I'm here, I'm here. If I'm not, I'm not.
Okay, but I'm asking one simple question. There's no such thing as transporters. Okay? All there are little booths. There's no transporters, no copiers, no nothing.
Right,
Nothing. All we have is booths with buttons, and they give you painless death.
So there's not going to be a copy?
No copy's going to be made. Okay. So you wouldn't step into the one that just simply gives you a painless death. Now we've got transporters of the kind I described. They make copies, and people go off and live with happy lives, as happy as anybody does. you wouldn't mind going in there if it were picked up. What's the difference?
Because no one's getting hurt.
You're dying.
You're dying in both cases.
What's your definition of hurt?
Oh, pain. All right, but it's the same in both cases. What's the difference?
Because if I don't feel it, I'm not even going to know I'm dead.
What's the difference? That's the same in both cases.
Because in the other one, other people will know I'm dead.
And they would be hurt.
Yes.
So, okay. So the reason not to go into the disintegrator booth when there's no transports, no copies, nothing. The reason not to go in there is because other people will mourn your loss. Now let's say you've got, now this is, I'm sorry, so I think that this actually follows and you probably approve of this. If there were no such other people, okay, or if you had been out of touch with those other people for long enough that they just didn't know what you were doing, and if they would go on, even if you were to die, they wouldn't know that you died, right? Okay, no transporters, no copies.
Then would I go?
Yeah.
Yes, but it would be like at a time when I didn't feel like, I wouldn't have to be really depressed, but I wouldn't want to be in the middle of something I like doing. If I was like walking down the street and I had no plans of doing anything for the next.
I see. I think that this was I'm getting more and more. I think that this reflects not so much views on personal identity, but views about life, more philosophical views about life and its value and its worth, and when it's valuable.
Life is way overrated.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't see dead people coming back. Oh, geez, look at the sanctity of life. You know.
Well, actually, you don't see dead people coming back doing anything.
That's what I mean.
Right.
You don't see. I mean, we can't prove reincarnation or anything like that. You know?
Okay, I got to move on to the wrap up, to the conclusion, which won't take long. Basically, the course is an introduction to philosophy, as you know, and I've maintained all along that what it is an introduction to philosophical issues, and not really a history course. We have looked at lots of historical figures, but the things that have been emphasized, and I think the things that we've talked about most are issues in various areas of philosophy. Now, there's no way in the world that I could introduce you to all the areas of philosophy, so it's been a smattering. But I wanted to just sort of rehash a little bit all the things, because there's a lot of things that we've done this quarter, a lot of stuff, and I wanted to tie it all together, at least in a recounting, and note that while historical figures were in there, there's also been some contemporary figures that we discussed. But the first topic that we talked about, and it was pretty much isolated there at the very beginning of the quarter, was political and social philosophy. The issues of the freedom of speech, first and foremost, were examined in our discussion of the Apology. It's important for all of these things to sort of try to come to understand what the positions are of the people that we do read and the people that we do discuss, but the basic issue there was freedom of speech. And then there was the question of obedience to law. To what extent should law be obeyed? Should it always be obeyed no matter what it says just because it's law? Well, we had two different views on that. We had one from a couple thousand years ago, Plato again, as enunciated in the Credo, through his spokesperson Socrates, and then we had Martin Luther King offering a contrary point of view. From political social philosophy, considerations of that kind, we moved into brief consideration of ethics, and again, it was kind of is not as deep as we might have gone into, because there's other courses. In fact, a parallel course to Introduction to Philosophy that could be taken here at RIT. A different introduction is just an ethics course. So that wasn't emphasized as much, but in the Meno we talked about virtue, what it was, could it be taught. I guess the thing that's most interesting to me, considering virtue after all for the Greeks was all kinds of excellence, not just what we might think of as moral excellence. The most interesting question for me there is what the source of virtue might be. And for Socrates anyway, Plato's spokesperson, it seemed that the source of virtue was not going to be other people. We're not going to be able to, maybe by their example perhaps, they can serve as somehow catalysts, they can serve as sources in that way, but virtue technically can't be taught. It's not something that could be given to you by someone else. That strikes me as an interesting thesis. The philosophy of religion we spent a couple of weeks on, partially because it was also a disguised logic lesson. But we talked about various arguments for the idea that there is a God. Anselm's Proslogian offered his ontological argument, an a priori type of argument. Guanilo, we didn't talk about Guanilo so much, but you read Guanilo, and that material offered some reasoning contemporary to Anselm's against Anselm's argument by a fellow monk who certainly believed in God all right, but didn't think that Anselm's argument really worked. That's there. The cosmological argument we addressed through the handout from William Rowe. That's an argument that might seem a little bit more plausible than that ontological argument. It's another argument based on causation, in its first draft anyway, but ultimately based on the principle of sufficient reason, suggesting that there's got to be a God because nothing exists or happens for no reason at all, and somehow or another this universe has got to be explained. That argument in its earlier form, earlier certainly than Bill Rowe, was famously used by St. Thomas Aquinas alongside of other proofs for God's existence. And then finally we addressed what we call the teleological argument, William Paley's argument for God's existence. So for a couple of weeks there, we talked at great length about God and why God should be thought to exist. The disguised logic lesson has to do with the nature of proof and the nature of argument. We also, in the course of those 2 weeks, briefly seemed to prove perhaps that 2 equals 1. We know now that, and I think this is probably something that you knew already, but now I've given some sort of explicit form to this, that where arguments go wrong, there's two places to look especially. One, do you agree with the presumptions on which the argument is based? And two, even if you agree with the presumptions, do the conclusions really follow from those presumptions? So the first place to look is to the basis of the argument. Is that something that is acceptable? And the second place to look is in the reasoning, line by line, if you like. And of course, it's in the reasoning that we found the mistake in the proof that 2 equals 1. And where the mistake might be in Anselm's argument, if there really is a mistake there, we didn't really establish. That's left up in the air. And it's left up in the air in large part because I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. I think there's a mistake in it, but I don't know exactly where the mistake is. It's not something I feel I could teach you. That's left to you to consider. But again, still staying in logic, this distinction between a priori reasoning, which is kind of foolproof if you can agree with the presumptions, and then a posteriori reasoning, which is not foolproof, which might lead us to false conclusions. That distinction is an important one, and it's important to know that proofs are hard to come by. I mean, real proofs of the kind that Plato wanted to limit knowledge to, they're scarce. It's hard to find such things. We wouldn't have much knowledge at all if we were willing to give the word knowledge only to things that could be proven. More of the stuff that we call knowledge comes to us from experience. Scientific knowledge, most of the common sense, the stuff that we would call common sense knowledge, it arises through experience, and therefore it's a posteriori rather than a priori. We talked about, again, in conjunction with Anselm's proof, we talked about the differences between direct proofs and indirect proofs. We became acquainted with the idea of a reductio ad absurdum, a proof that tries to show that there's something again, was a logical, it also has applications in math, of course, but it's part of the lesson in logic. And then finally, a very brief introduction to Venn diagrams, a way of illustrating logical reasoning, which shows, I think, more graphically, well, certainly more graphically, but more vividly than any other way I could think of, demonstrates the force in the idea that conclusions have to follow from some premises in a priori or deductive reasoning. The reason that the conclusions have to follow, I mean, the source of the idea of that necessity stems from the fact that the information in the conclusion is already contained in those premises. It's not an added something else. It's not even a move from somewhere to something else. It's really deductive argument, a priori argument, really is nothing more than the unpacking of information that's already in the assumptions and in the premises. We went over that. We moved from the philosophy of religion and logic to epistemology. In Plato, the primary question in the Meno was, what is knowledge? And if there is knowledge, what is its character? For Plato, to be known, something has to be provable by you. I mean, to know something, you have to be able to prove it. Aristotle, as it happens, we didn't go over this, as it happens, Aristotle probably would not have such severe constraints in his use of the term knowledge. He was more like an empiricist, but he still was Plato's student, still took proof very seriously. What we did see were Aristotle's efforts to try to talk about how the various different ways in which things can be explained, his four causes, as we called them, and his emphasis on the fact that explaining something fully would require, understanding all of the four causes of that thing. The material cause, that's what it's made of. The formal cause, what kind of thing it is. The efficient cause, what brought it about, and the final cause, what its purpose is, what its function is in a larger whole, what role it plays in conjunction with other things. Still in epistemology, you can understand. Before we move to Descartes, who's next in the list, Aristotle already offers some advice about science, and the links between the history of philosophy and the history of science, I hope, are by now plain. The motives for all of this stuff are the same, trying to gain clarity on things that are not yet understood. And indeed, the philosophical questions are the ones that, at least in my characterization, still remain unclear. And scientific progress is made as more and more things get clear. And the philosopher does his job right if he's finally successful in making some matter clear that hadn't been clear before, and thereby removing it from the list of philosophical questions. So I'm not sure that I emphasized that at the beginning, but I hope that the parallel between what scientists are up to and also I think what people in religions are up to, they're trying to achieve clarity in certain areas as well. There's a common goal in all of these disciplines that link them. And indeed, it's easier for me these days to see the connections than it is for me to make a clear line between them. It's harder for me to see what precisely distinguishes science from philosophy than it is for me to see that there are a lot of things that they share. But Aristotle's four causes begin to clarify what sorts of things scientists, too, should look for if they want to explain stuff. And Descartes explicitly then ventures into the area of trying to provide solid foundations for science in his meditations. He's looking for things that are indubitable. In that he resembles Plato and the history of the rationalists. Then he's looking for things that are not the product of a posteriori reasoning. He's looking for a priori truths, things that are true, that we know to be true independently of all experience. In part because that would be more certain. I mean, experience, you can only have so much experience, and the conclusions we draw from our past experience often have to be revised in the light of subsequent experience. So if we could find anything at all that were really secure, really guaranteed, really indubitable, that would indeed put a rock-hard, solid foundation under science. And that was Descartes' quest. He finally arrived at the idea that we could rely on what he called clear and distinct ideas. And the best translation of that I've been able to give is that he thought that we could rely on things that were logically necessary. So once again, like Plato, he thought that the things that we should rely on for now science, not just knowledge in general, but for science, are things that are logically necessary. Clear and distinct ideas, like the fact that he exists while he is thinking. He can't not exist while thinking. And the fact that 2 plus 3 equals 5. It must equal 5, given the definitions of those symbols, 2 plus 3 equals and 5. Locke and Hume, on the other hand, offered us for the first time an epistemological view that opposed that of the rationalists, people like Plato and Descartes. In their view, experience is in the end the only source of anything that at least is content-filled, any knowledge that has any significant content. For Locke, experience is the source of everything through the two varieties of experience, sensation and reflection. For Hume, Hume's arguments actually tend toward a skeptical position about whether we can really know anything at all. That the word knowledge, if it's supposed to mean stuff that's absolutely secure, that doesn't seem like, at least given Hume's arguments, it doesn't seem like there's much of anything at all that it could really accurately be used to describe. So Hume's empirical view almost leads us to kind of a skeptical position, where skepticism is the view that we really don't know anything. So that's where we left off. It certainly isn't the end of the discussion. Since Hume wrote in the 18th century, there's been lots of back and forth between empiricists and rationalists. Each can point to important features of our growing body of knowledge as evidence that their position is right. I mean, for example, just take physics, modern physics as an example. Rationalists can point to the fact that modern physics is highly mathematical. And it's interesting to watch other disciplines like economics, and to some extent disciplines like psychology, which want to be scientific. They want to be as scientific as physics and chemistry and biology. They want to establish a firm base for their science, just like Descartes wanted to establish. And often what they do is they turn to mathematical reasoning as their foothold on reliability. And so the neo-rationalists, modern-day rationalists, can kind of point to the important role that math plays in the sciences and say, see, that's where our anything like certainty can arise. But at the same time, again within physics, it's vital to notice how empirical those scientists are. It's not just that the scientists. I mean, there are theoretical physicists who never go into a lab, but they're not the whole of the science. I mean, without those lab physicists, the experimentalists, the observers, the people who go out and look at the world, bring in evidence that then is supposed to, on the one hand, perhaps test theories, on the other hand, maybe provide support for new theories. Without those experimentalists, physics wouldn't be physics. The sciences would be just philosophy. It would be idle speculation. So the empiricists can point to the important role of observation and laboratory work, experimental work in the sciences, and can make strong claims there too. So the debate goes on between the rationalists and empiricists. One's inclined to say, well, we need a little bit of both. But then, and we didn't go into this, the question is, well, exactly, what is this thing that we call science? What are its methods? We need a little bit of both. How does that interact? How can you bring mathematics to bear on observation? What importance does the theory have? What importance does the observation have? Those are questions that come up in philosophy of science, especially, and there's an entire course that you could take on in that. For metaphysics, another area of philosophy, we asked the question, what is substance? That was raised early in the quarter with Aristotle. Aristotle also wondered, what is the sign of the natural? He had his own conclusions about what substance is and what the sign of the natural is, what makes the difference between natural and non-natural objects. But we only touched on that briefly and then left it quickly for other questions. We came back to metaphysics in talking about the cosmological argument. We talked about the nature of the physical world, questions about causation, especially in the first draft of that cosmological argument. Do the causes of things stretch backward infinitely in time, or would there be a first cause? Whether you interpret this religiously or not, it's an interesting metaphysical issue. Is it possible to conceive of a universe in which things just have always been happening and there hasn't been a beginning and there won't be an end? Very intriguing question. And then if there is a beginning, how can you conceive of something before it? Does that make sense? So questions about causation arise, questions about time, questions about, the second draft of the cosmological argument seemed to acknowledge the possibility of an infinite stretch of causes and effects that go backward forever and go forward forever into the future, but still seemed to feel that it needed an explanation for it, that sequence itself. We still need an explanation for it. Do we? Interesting philosophical question that's raised there. In the talking about the teleological argument for God's existence, we discussed the difference between things produced by chance and things that are designed. The very idea of chance, we didn't mention this then, but if you think about that, and I hoped to invigorate some thinking on the question of what chance processes are, what really is chance? The things that are often taken to be chance-like, like sort of the products of a random number generator, or you can develop formulas that produce what appear to be something like chance-like circumstances. They themselves have patterns. Chance-like distributions have patterns, as it happens. And one wonders what chance is. I mean, you could derive a formula that will produce a random sequence of numbers of numerical digits between 0 and 9, for example, and you can design that. But then it itself will have. I mean, it itself is a formula, after all, that's producing this. Now the question is, is it chance if it's produced by a formula? There's very peculiar questions about the relationship between chance and order that begin to be touched upon when we discuss the difference between chance and design in that teleological argument. And again, there in the teleological argument, talking about the nature of the physical world, is it really true that the stuff that has a high degree of complexity and a high degree of order, does that indicate some intentional design or not? Can chance processes actually bring about all the complexity of the human brain? Just to take an example. Including, as it does, the phenomenon of consciousness, awareness. It's not just that we have a complex object here, we have a complex object that is somehow aware or conscious. A metaphysical question. And then putting it that way yields the last topic that we discussed, that problem of personal identity. That's a metaphysical problem as well. In the reading, questions about immortality were raised, potential immortality. They should hark back, in addition to stuff that was discussed long ago in the Credo, stuff that we dealt with at the very beginning of the quarter. Questions about the pre-existence of the soul addressed in the Meno. The question of what kind of thing is a person is especially interesting to us as persons, but there's even parallels in trying to think about what sort of thing is a car. And we use the Toyota example of that. The idea of an enduring thing, a thing that is the same through time, even though it's changing, re-raises questions that were raised at the beginning of the quarter and some 2,500 or 3,000 years ago by Heraclitus concerning the nature of the world. Heraclitus, you remember, said everything is like that. Everything is a flux, a change. Well, is it? What are the differences between change and permanence? And in my own case, what is it that identifies what I am? What is it the stuff that I'm made of? Is there some sort of a soul or a mind or a non-material something that guides the body during life? What kind of thing is that, if there is such a thing? Or are we better understood neither as minds nor as bodies, but rather as patterns, as arrays of information or distributions of matter energy? Those are the questions, metaphysical questions, that we asked there in that last little bit. The course, as I say, has emphasized issues. I've used the historical figures mostly because often it's their due. I mean, sometimes it's these historical figures like Plato. They're the people who first thought of these questions. So in a way, they're the ones I wanted you to go look at. I wanted you to go see what they had to say about these questions. But curiously, in spite of the difficulty of reading some of those people, fact of the matter is their presentation of these issues is often the clearest one, or at least among the clearest of presentations that exist. Modern presentations of philosophical issues, like modern presentations about just about anything, are overly specialized. They're often require all kinds of knowledge that most people don't have. Philosophers in the olden days were writing for just intelligent people. This was like literature. It was just like essays about complex questions, but they weren't writing for other philosophers, people who were trained at a university and had a PhD in that particular discipline. So that's another reason for using these historical figures. I'd hope to acquaint you with areas of philosophy, like philosophy of religion, philosophy of science, epistemology, metaphysics, logic, and the others. The historical dimension went from the pre-Socratics to John Perry, from Plato to Martin Luther King, from Aristotle to William Rowe. So we kind of bounced back and forth between famous dead people and perhaps not so famous living ones. I want to re-emphasize something that I emphasized at the beginning of the quarter, and that's that here we've been dealing only with the Western tradition. It's a small sample of what might be called world philosophy. There are echoes of some of these questions and some of these topics in philosophies generated in China, in Africa, in America prior to the coming of the Europeans, in their literatures, in their poetry, in their religions. The questions come up there too. And there's lots of interesting parallels. There's also lots of interesting nuance, differences. So if you were to pursue your work in philosophy, I encourage you also to look at stuff outside the Western tradition. It's very intriguing. In the end, I want to reclaim that philosophy isn't something that's really very much out of the ordinary. Philosophy is a part of a normal human life. I argue that philosophy is a need. It has to do with the kinds of creatures we are. We are not creatures that function merely on instinct. We function in terms of our understanding and our belief systems. The beliefs that we have aren't, useless baggage that we carry around. We believe in the things that we believe in, to the extent that we actively believe in them at all, because they seem to us to get us where we want to go. They seem to us to offer guides to get us through life from day to day. Now, since they're important, they're the means that we use, our beliefs. They're the things that we use to get through our lives. They're in need of constant testing and correction. They're the sorts of things that you don't want to be wrong. So better, in a way, to be constantly exploring alternatives, always sort of checking up on your beliefs. So the most important ones, first and foremost, the most important ones of our beliefs are the ones I think that we should be challenging in the sense of comparing and contrasting alternatives. It's a bad idea for us to be resistant to the exploration of alternatives to our own beliefs, because that's the way we can ensure getting locked up in a belief system that is ineffective. Belief systems need to be checked just like any other system, any other machine. You have to check it, make sure it's doing its job from time to time, and with beliefs, the best way to do that is to check it against alternatives. I mean, 9 times out of 10, you'll continue to believe the thing you believed in the first place. But then there's that one time when you say, hey, you know, that other belief, they've got something there. There's something in that. And that's when you learn. That's when you go from a more parochial to a wider and more inclusive belief system. That, generally, is the way I have been trying to bring philosophy to you. I hope there's been some interesting issues there, and I hope, either through courses or not, but I hope you'll continue your work in philosophy. But it's been fun to work with you.